Yeah, they have the program tonight.
Oh, God. Okay. Hang on. Unaccustomed as I am to public speaking.
How long will your program be?
Well, that's something I was going to talk about. Actually. I kind of did a dry run on this afternoon, and it clocked in at just a little bit over an hour and 10 minutes. So I'm going to try to zip through it and make it work. And I just realized I sure doesn't have a shirt pocket. If you're wondering about all the cameras, I need some, I need to videotape this, but I just need some videotape of me giving a speech somewhere for something else I'm doing. So don't read anything into it at all. So I'm getting different angles and stuff on it. So do what?
We'll do yours next.
You can't tackle you then?
Yeah, you can. I can edit profusely. Yeah.
Kelly, can you speak up a little bit?
That was my question. If I almost brought a boombox or something, or a guitar amp or something, and I was wondering if I was going to have to yell for an hour and 10 minutes or not. Let me set up a couple of things here. Okay, so with a call to meeting, can you lift that up just a little bit? Let's try. See if that works. There, how's that? Okay, everyone see and hear okay? Okay, I thought with the, I'm right in your space here. Right. Go ahead. Well, I'd rather have you in the picture. Okay, well, with a call to the meeting like that, I thought there might be more people coming, except for that part. And I kind of wondered if that ran some people away. But anyway, so I guess you all, anyone have any idea what the three letters would be? Any guesses? Where'd Carl go? Okay. Well, he's our instructor. I was going to ask him a bunch of stuff about this.
STD?
No. Okay. No, the three letters are AQP. Has anyone ever heard of that? I'm getting blank face. You not heard of it? Okay. All right. Close. Okay. Well, you're probably wondering then, what is AQP? I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Okay, you're probably wondering what is AQP, but I'm not going to tell you that just yet. It's going to be about slide 60 or so before I tell you that. But we're going to talk about why AQP, and I wish I had the little clicker so it didn't look so bad here. Okay, so the FAA was created basically to protect aviation, and part of that is the public doesn't need to be thinking that everybody dies in aviation, so they've been working for decades to reduce the accident rate and the number of people dying in aviation accidents. And years ago, prior to the late 70s, the biggest and most publicized aviation accidents were all mid-air collisions. Early in aviation, pilots ran into each other trying to get onto the same runway. And they came up with, they'd have a guy in a tower with flags or flares that would give signals to who can land and who could take off. And that eventually developed into the airport traffic area. And then in the late 50s, there was a mid-air crash between, I think, a Constellation and a DC-7 over the Grand Canyon, and it just rained luggage and dead bodies and shrapnel into the Grand Canyon. It was huge news for weeks. And then like 2-3 weeks later, another one happened right about the same place. And then in the late 60s, they had some incidences where small aircraft would have a mid-air collision with an airliner and bring it down. I think there was one in Indianapolis, and there were like 4 or 5 in a row. And they came, and that's when they developed the TCAs. And then they to solve all that, the solution to that was they invested in radars and the National Airspace System. And that kind of got rid of all of the mid-air collisions. Well, we also had a problem with navigation. People would get lost, they'd run into weather, and so the FAA made a fairly substantial investment in infrastructure for all kinds of nav aids and the National Weather Service and all this stuff. And so we don't have quite the weather-related accidents that we had back in the 60s and 70s or the 50s. people aren't getting lost quite the way they were. That used to be a real problem. And then we had problems with bad designs of airplanes, bad maintenance. The FAA came up with a system where you had to have certifications to do the maintenance or inspections. The aircraft designs had to be certified through a program, and then after the plane was built, there'd be airworthiness directives for things they found later, so on. And that solved those problems. So about 1980 or so, the FAA realized that most of the remaining aircraft accidents were usually the result of some sort of pilot error. And there's the ICAO had a quote that I put in there that between 1980 and 1989, 73% of all accidents worldwide were avoidably crew caused. So we've gotten down to where most of the accidents that they're thinking might be preventable have to do with pilot error. So the main focus initially was on airliners. How do we improve the incidence of pilot error in air crews for the airliners? But it happens all over. And anyway, let me go back. Anyway, the only solution that anyone really had involved pilot training or pilot selection. There's no real public infrastructure you could invest in. There's nothing else you can do other than train the pilots and make sure you have the right people as pilots. So that was about 1980. As you can see, prior to about 1990 or so, general aviation deaths were up around 1,200 people a year. And that kind of, when they got the airspace system figured out, the weather service got better, all of the maintenance things got figured out, and everything was in place, and all those systems that they've been working on through the 40s and 50s and 60s and 70s all started working somewhere around 1980, 1985. And the accident rate, at least the number of deaths, settled out to about 700 or 800. And it's kind of been declining very slowly ever since, but that decline kind of matches the decline in general aviation usage anyway. The rate hasn't changed a whole lot, but we're still killing 300 or 400 people a year in general aviation. This does not include the airlines. So that's the next slide. This is the airlines, same time frame. Now these are 5-year intervals over here, and then starting in 1990, these are 1-year intervals. This doesn't really show it, but 60s, 70s, 80s, and back in the 50s, it was several hundred people a year were dying in airlines. Every once in a while, you'd have a year where there wasn't much happening, but man, one big airliner goes in, there's 200 people. And the gross numbers weren't quite as big, but they were well publicized. And it was a real political problem. So right about 1990, they came up with an idea. Anyway, and they implemented something in the airlines. They did something. They had a few crashes in the mid-90s, and then anyone have any idea what this spike is in 2001? 9/11. Yeah, so if you take that outlier statistically out of that, this would be down here somewhere. Starting about 1997, all the way to the present, you had there's that thing in Buffalo where that commuter airline went in, and there was another thing or two. And then in the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a couple of 3 deaths here and there in the airlines. I don't know if somebody tripped over a fuel line and died or what, but we haven't had major air disasters, at least not in the United States, going back into the late 90s. For the last 20 years. The last 10 or 12 years, it's been, these numbers are all zero. 0 deaths in airlines. I'm sure you're aware of that. You're shaking your head yes. So some people know that. So contrast that with general aviation. So what's the difference? What happened? What did they do? And why isn't general aviation doing that? Well, obviously the airlines are doing something differently than people in general aviation. And that's something we're thinking is something called AQP. Okay, so I guess I've got you convinced that AQP may be something, whatever it is. All right, so Now, I'm going to cut most of this out. I was going to talk about how I was led into AQP and studying it. And I was just going to talk about all of Dad's planes and my experiences with all of those. And there's a whole list of them. I talk about different things, but that's all gone. But basically, in dealing with all of Dad's planes, Dad would go out and do aerobatics. You know, he'd slow roll the 310. And yeah, it was really neat, but how long are you going to tempt fate, you know? And, you know, I'd get in a plane, I just want to go somewhere. I didn't want to turn my stomach inside out. And I was kind of, you know, and these planes, man, they were old airplanes that, you know, he'd buy from, you know, Paul Whedon and some of those guys. And yeah, you kind of wonder if they were put together right. And it was nothing for him to just roll open the door and hop in and blast off to Springdale to go have lunch. And you should plan more. So I was always worried about dying in an airplane. So I was always wondering what could I do to improve. So anyway, so I somewhere in the late 80s, around 1990, somewhere around in there, I went through this thought process about 30 years ago. How am I going to avoid dying in an airplane? And so there's a thought process. How do you do that? How do you avoid dying in an airplane? Well, the first thing you would do is just don't get on an airplane. Well, I'm not going to do that. I enjoy it too much. It gives you freedom. I do like doing aerobatics. I mean, not all the time, but yeah. I mean, how do you go about it? Well, if you think it's like, how do you avoid getting hurt by a lawnmower? How do you avoid car accidents? You know, how do you avoid car accidents? You look at how people are crashing, and you know, don't do what they're doing. You know, the way to avoid dying in an airplane is, number one, you figure out how are people dying in airplanes? What are they doing when they die in an airplane? And then you don't do that. That was my solution. That's what I was thinking. So I started to try to investigate, you know, of all the crazy things Dad did and he survived, and you hear people crashing doing simple things somewhere. What are people really doing what are they doing when they crash their airplanes? What causes them to crash? And I started to try to research that and just couldn't get very far. Now, the NTSB, now if you look at, you know, what do people think is the way, what do people think causes airplane crashes? Most people think that mechanical failure of some sort causes them to crash. Well, it does, but usually it's either a mechanical failure or it's the pilot screws something up. Generally, most people think it's one of those two. Well, there's actually a third. It can be mechanical failure, the pilot makes a mistake, or something fails and the pilot fails to deal with it. You know, he's faced with a forced landing and he dies in the forced landing, but if he did it right, he should have been able to survive the forced landing. So anyway, so you look at, so I tried to see where I was at. Okay, so I've kind of lost my place here. So I started looking for information on how were people dying in aircraft accidents. Do I still have everybody? Has anyone fallen asleep yet? Okay, I'm going to take a quick drink here. Anyway, before the internet, it was really hard to find specific information on how people were dying in airplanes. Now, the NTSB would go out and investigate every crash. They'd send teams out there, they'd pull the plane apart, they'd investigate everything, they'd write a big report. The report would go into a file somewhere in DC. And the FAA would get it, maybe, but it wasn't really accessible to the public. I mean, it was public information. If you wanted to look at it, you could go to DC, or you could write to them and have them send it to you, and they charge you a whole bunch of money to print it. You just didn't get it. So the information you'd get from your biannual flight review guy, because he's getting stuff from the FAA saying we're having a problem with runway incursion or this or that. So you know that's what people are doing. You could get other recurrent training. They teach you about how they think people are dying. You talk to other pilots. You hear about, oh yeah, Joe Schmo landed short of trying to land at Gimlin because he was short of gas. He didn't plan. Well, okay, he didn't plan gas, so I need to learn to plan gas, for example. Or you go to pilot meetings, MPA, wings programs and stuff. People would talk about what people are doing, and every once in a while you'd hear something in the news. So and so crashed his airplane out by Republic. They think he did this, But all the information you were getting, it was all anecdotal. You'd hear about this crash, and you'd hear about that crash, and you get little pieces and parts, and you really couldn't put together a big picture. However, you didn't have access to the data. But there were some people that did have access to that data. There are various magazines. I'll just go through these real quick. Basically, anyone who wrote for AOPA Pilot or Flying Magazine, Trade a Plane would do articles sometimes. There are probably 30, 40 magazines. And someone writing about a subject would have the resources and the time to go spend a week, go to DC, look through all the NTSB files, read them, and do all this stuff. And then they'd write an article about it. And that's where you were getting most of your information. Flying Magazine would do an article about, VMC and twins, and you'd learn about that kind of stuff. And that's the information you were getting. There was Dad subscribed to something called Pilot's Audio Update, which had a lot of information in it. And the ABC Wide World of Flying, there were VHS tapes all over the place. But that's where you got your information. King Schools did them, Sporties, and so on. Who else had access to the data? The FAA, of course, and the NTSB. And every once in a while, you trickle out something from the FAA would make some sort of pronouncement about, we have a lot of people dying doing such and such. But there's one other party that had access to the data, the airlines. They actually had teams of people that would call through all of the NTSB data and figure out what people are doing and dying in airplanes. They also had a little more data. They had from their own airliners, when some airliner did something and got in trouble, and they did something and survived it, there was no crash, it didn't get reported to the NTSB, but they had data on, these guys had an engine out and they survived it, what did they do? So the airlines actually had a lot of data on that. All right, so we get the internet in the mid-90s. The NTSB puts up their website and they put all their reports on the website. So you can go in there and there's been some others come up. There's Catherine's report. I don't know, have any of you ever heard of Catherine's report? I don't know how long that's been there. Anyway. And there's several others. I don't know how old they were, but the NTSB is the one I was on earlier. You go to the NTSB, this is the modern version, but you can go in and you can search their accident database. And you can search it by the make and model of the airplane and the date range and where it was, and give me all of the crashes in Missouri in this date range, and give me all the crashes within so many miles of Chicago or whatever. Give me all the crashes for 64 to 74 Cessna 182s. You can search it like that, and it was helpful. Or you could search it by month. And you click on a month, and it give you a list of all the crashes that happened that month. And it'll tell you where it was, what the plane was, the date, how many people died, and some other stuff in this table. And you click on it, and it would give you a synopsis of what happened and their determination of probable cause. Now, it's not as easy to do now because when you click on it, you get a PDF, but it'll give you a synopsis of the analysis of what they think happened. And here's where it was, when it was. This is one I just pulled off at random. This is a King Air 90, and it ran into turbulence and it damaged the aircraft. And they put out a probable cause and it said what they think caused the accident. So I would sit there and I would go through those and click them one at a time and read those, and I spent hours. I spent days just browsing those. And after a while, I start trying to piece together, okay, what's consistent here? Now, I was interested in, I started flying the Debonair. I wanted to know what killed people in Bonanzas. And so I went through and searched all of the Bonanza stuff, and I started reading those. And there's a few things. Bad landings, especially in the pattern. And the thing people do in Bonanzas that they don't seem to do as much in other airplanes is, when they're coming in on an instrument approach, they tend to go below minimums. They're just really trying to get to the airport no matter how low it is, and they end up crashing somehow. The usual VFR and VMC, fuel starvation, exhaustion, or fuel mismanagement. The Bonanzas, especially the early ones, had multiple tanks and a little switch down about here you can't see, you had to feel for it. And there were all kinds of problems with fuel management, and people died from that. They'd crash on takeoff because they'd have an engine failure on takeoff, and they really didn't know what they wanted to do after that. And 90% of the time, they'd take off in their Bonanza, the engine would quit, and they would try to make it back to the airport they just took off of. And the Bonanza will not do the impossible turn, if you know what that is. I can prove it with arithmetic, with performance tables. It won't do it. And yet, people continually tried the impossible turn, and they crash 300 or 400 yards short of the airport. Loss of control in flight was another one, and they had mechanical problems, usually the first flight after maintenance or a gear up of some sort. All right, that's what I was finding with the Bonanzas. Same sort of thing with the Baron. And I'd look up the 182. Interestingly, what people did in 182 that they didn't do elsewhere was, flight into terrain at night. The terrain would rise faster than they were climbing, and they'd just fly straight into it. That seemed to happen a lot on 182s. Bouncy landings, they'd bounce off the runway and hit a hangar or something and stuff. Another one I didn't list here, there seemed to be an awful lot of commercial pilots who were alcoholics who would get out of the airlines and get a job flying a 182 somewhere. They'd get liquored up in a 182 and crash it. And that scenario seemed to happen more in 182s than anything else I'd see. You pick up weird things like that. But the other thing, and then 150s, what kills people in a 150? Buzzing. Screwed up go-arounds, stalls and spins. They go too slow in the pattern, they stall and spin. Or they try to go do aerobatics in their 150. Or they get totally lost. They're flying A to B, and they find them totally out of gas, crashed in the desert up at point C somewhere. That happens more in a 150 than anything else. Okay. But at the same time, I was starting to see patterns of what was consistent airplane to airplane. What were people doing that killed themselves? And you could do this. The stuff I was noticing was stall spin out of control in the pattern, usually on approach. And what did that get me to doing? I got to where, and I still do this today, and I shouldn't do it, I come in high, I come in fast, I'm faster than I should be on approach. And I've got the skills to land really short, but I come in 100 miles an hour over the fence. I'm not going to stall it because I see so much of that happen. Spatial disorientation is a big one, VFR and IMC. Crash on takeoff. They lose power on takeoff. They try to do the impossible turn, or they just pick the wrong field. They don't know how to do a forced landing, and so on. Anyway, so I was doing that, but okay, so I was doing that for my own benefit, but what else could I do with it? Well, here lately I thought, I'm starting to do YouTube videos. I thought, I'll do videos on what kills people in a Cessna 150, what kills people in a Bonanza. I found out after proposing that to some people that YouTube has an algorithm that will determine what videos, that when you open YouTube, that you get thumbnails of a bunch of videos. And their algorithm determines what you're going to be exposed to. And everyone says, oh, well, they're trying to get the ones you're most likely to watch. Well, no, they're trying to put in front of you the videos they think you're most likely to watch that an advertiser is going to want to buy advertising for. And if it talks about people dying, death, people getting killed, if you have the word kill, die, anything like that in the title, your video goes to the bottom of the list. So I couldn't even do that. I can't talk about how do you kill people in a 150, how do you kill people in a 182. So I really had nowhere to go with all this. So I've been thinking about this for years, 20-some years. Have I lost anybody yet? Everyone's kind of shaking their heads, so okay. So anyway, I looked around YouTube, and I stumbled across some videos done by a guy named Dan Greider. Jan, you heard me ask you about him. You saw him speak somewhere once, I think, at a USDA meeting somewhere, I believe. In Kentucky, maybe?
You talked about that in Kentucky, possible causes.
Yeah, probable cause, yeah. Yeah, he's been pushing this AQP thing. Now, Dan Greider, I think he's a little bit older than I am. He was a corporate pilot of some sort. I think he may have flown for Walmart. I'm not sure. I think he lived in Northwest Arkansas for a while. Went to the airlines. I think he was at Delta. I'm not real sure, but he was at airlines for a while. And I guess he retired out of those two somehow, and he's been doing instructing since then. He has a DC-3, and you can get your type rating in a DC-3 from Dan Greider. And it's only at the bargain price, I think he heard him mention $1,800 an hour, I think, to rent his DC-3. Anyway, so he has a YouTube video called Probable Cause, and he is the guy that is evangelizing the concept of AQP for general aviation. Now I'm going to get into AQP and tell you how this all relates to AQP. All right, the other thing about Dan Greider is he's kind of into bluegrass. He'll give a speech, and then when he's done with his speech, he'll play the banjo or something, or he does a YouTube video. He always gets out, he and his kids get out the guitars and plays, so that's kind of his shtick. The other thing is he does skydiving, and there's some folklore out there about that I don't know is true, but he's, what's the other thing? Oh yeah, he's done a series of videos about D.B. Cooper. He thinks he knows who D.B. Cooper is. Have you run into this?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
Oh, you've heard of him. Okay. Well, he by God thinks he's got D.B. Cooper nailed, and the family is saying, yeah, our granddad was D.B. Cooper, and he's got everybody in the world pissed at him about what he's saying about who this guy is, and I don't know whether he's just nuts or if he's really got it right, and there's a whole industry of people out there writing books and doing seminars about D.B. Cooper. Who's going to buy your book on D.B. Cooper if Dan Greider just gives you D.B. Cooper's phone number? So that's another thing he's famous for. But anyway, he's the one pushing the whole AQP for general aviation. Now, I was watching all this stuff. He kept talking about AQP this, AQP that, and I didn't really get into it, but he said this one thing. And I think this is a quote. I don't remember where he said it. I can't find it. But he said something like this. He said, what we need to be doing in training pilots and recurrent training is figure out how pilots are killing themselves in airplanes and train for that. And I was like, well, that's just like what I was saying. Figure out how people are dying in airplanes and don't do that. I thought, okay, this guy's on the same wavelength I am. I started watching everything he had. And started watching everything there was about AQP. Well, there's other people doing AQP. There's Aviation 101. There's a whole list of people doing it. But if you watch their videos, man, half the time Dan Greider's in the film with them, helping them evangelize about AQP. So now you're kind of wondering, okay, what is AQP? AQP stands for, drum roll, Advanced Qualification Program, which doesn't tell you anything about AQP, about what it really is. But this is the FAA definition. The Advanced Qualification Program training system is developed using a systematic training program methodology. AQP is a voluntary, data-driven alternative means of compliance to the traditional regulatory requirements under blah, 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 121, which is airlines, 135, which is like charter stuff. Okay, so what's the difference between, it talks about alternative and traditional. So what's the difference between the two? So before you do AQP, what are we doing for check rides and BFRs and stuff in your recurring training? What are they teaching you to do? Well, basically, they're having you demonstrate maneuvers. And in the airlines, they would have you demonstrate, they'd go in for these 6-month and 1-year checks. They'd have to demonstrate their ability to do various maneuvers. They'd have to climb to altitude and do this, and they'd have to, you know, when you take off, someone would pull the mixture at V1, and you're supposed to know the procedure and all this stuff, and you're supposed to be able to do turns right and all that stuff. And it was a pass-fail thing. And the guys would go into these checks afraid they were going to fail it. They weren't learning anything. It was just an obstacle they had to get past to keep their job. They weren't using it as a learning experience. Anyway, so traditional GA training, your check ride, these are the kind of things that you look at. Power on stalls, power off stalls, cross control stalls, accelerated stall. 18 different types of stalls. You're supposed to know all of them. You're supposed to be able to recognize them. Spin recovery. They don't do that as much because people actually die trying to do the spin recovery, but they talk about it. You know, you're supposed to do slow flight, steep spiral, chandelles, lazy eights, pylons, around pylons and stuff, turns around a point, steep turns, and my all-time favorite, 360 turns level, or ascending at 500 feet a minute, or descending 500 feet a minute. Those are basic, you know, those are basic instrument skills, right? Yeah, and that's what they make you do. Short, and then they have you do short field takeoff. They want you to do a soft field takeoff, emergency descent. Then they talk about emergency landings, forced landings, and they do go through that a little bit. And they make sure that you do pre-flight planning and inspection. And they talk about go-arounds. Now on your BFRs, you know, you do your oral portion and your questions are, here's a sign with a red background and white letters, what does that mean? Here's a sign with black background and yellow letters, what is that? You know, that's taxiway, you know. And they kind of quiz you on, do you know those things? And that's what we're doing right now. General aviation, and I'll just read this. General aviation continues to place emphasis on the review of unrelated maneuvers that have no connection with time-critical real-world scenarios. Okay, and so what the thinking is that all this stuff that you're training for when you do your BFR, when you do recurrent training, they train you to do these maneuvers and things, and you get to be good at them. But what does it really have to do with how you know what you're doing when you crash the airplane? So that's where we get to AQP. After AQP, what AQP is, that's the FAA. Dan Greider didn't talk about this part. This is in the FAA documentations, but it's line, if I can remember it, line operable. Let me get to it here. I should have had this right here in front of me. Hang on. Aha. These are the acronyms I couldn't remember. Line-oriented flight training, and then what is called line operational simulation. And those are scenarios. What they do in AQP is they put you in either an airplane or a simulator, and you go out and you actually simulate engine out. You actually simulate losing an engine on takeoff. You simulate whatever you can think of. Not being able to feed fuel from a critical tank. All these different things that can go wrong, they go through these scenarios. And it's not really pass-fail, you're trying to learn what to do. They're not trying to fail you, they're trying to teach you and get you to think ahead of time so that when something goes wrong, you're not trying to figure it out while you're up there, you just do it. And that's basically what's happening with AQP. And what they do is they've gone through the airlines early on went through and figured out what pilots were doing wrong, what they were consistently doing wrong when they did a certain type of crash. And then they would structure their training around putting all the pilots through that scenario and training them how to survive that particular critical thing. Now, with air crews, they focus a lot on crew resource management. That had to do with communication and management and leadership. You had crews with multiple people, and the interpersonal stuff was a critical thing there. They would set up these scenarios. They tell you what you were doing, but the abnormality that they were going to throw at you wasn't part of the simulation. You discovered that in the simulation. So, but it was centered around doing all of these scenarios. They call them scenarios. And mostly it was in the simulator. It's voluntary, but they instituted this in 1990, and I think everything became official in 2005, and it's pretty much ubiquitous all through Part 121. Almost all the airliners are doing this. Am I losing anybody yet? He's about to lose it over here. Do what?
Snoring.
Nobody's snoring. Okay. All right. Now, what they're doing is considered an extension of the traditional requirements. The FAA says what you're doing in AQP, and it's the airlines that are doing this. The airlines design the AQP program for their pilots. They design it not only for their pilots, but it's specific to the aircraft that they're flying a lot of times. They say it's an extension of traditional requirements because they figure that if you're doing these scenarios, in order to complete the scenarios, they're going to have to be satisfied that you're able to do turns about a point and short field, soft field, blah, 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 blah. You know, if you're able to do the scenarios, you've got all the flying skills. You're going to be demonstrating that. So you're going to be doing all the traditional stuff in the course of going through all these scenarios. So they think that it's something that's beyond the traditional recurrent training, and that's why they call it advanced qualification program. And by calling it advanced training, people want to do it. They don't look at it as a possible career-ending test. It's actually something that's going to benefit them. Okay, so that's what the airlines are doing. So how does this extend to general aviation? Well, it's data-driven. You figure out what are people doing that kills them in an airplane. That's the first step. Okay, so Dan Greider went through about, 5, 6, 8 years ago. He came out of the airlines. He'd done all this AQP stuff at Delta or wherever it was he was. And he said, how does this apply to GA? Hold on just a second. Anyway, and he went through the same NTSB stuff that everybody goes through. And he started classifying the various crashes out there. And he put them into two broad categories. What he calls CFIT, or controlled flight into terrain, and UFIT, uncontrolled flight into terrain. Controlled flight into terrain means that your control, when you hit the ground, your controls are still working. Meaning, if you turn the wheel to the left, it's going to try to bank to the left. If you pull back, it's going to try to go up. If you hit the right rudder, it's going to yaw to the right. That's controlled flight into terrain. Uncontrolled flight into terrain is usually you've stalled, or you're spinning, or you're in some sort of condition where you do everything you can to the controls, has no effect. You're just a passenger riding it into the ground. And within those two broad classifications, he came up with, he calls them buckets. They're classifications. He'll take an accident synopsis and he'll put it into a bucket. And he came up with 18 or 20 of these buckets, I guess he calls them. And I'll just go through them real quick. Under controlled flight into terrain, spatial disorientation, day, spatial disorientation night, intentional IMC after takeoff, unintentional IMC after takeoff. That's, you think it's 1200 overcast, you take off, it's actually 300 overcast, and you're in the clouds. Unintentional IMC. Buzzing acrobatics, or what I call being a dumbass. Mishandled abnormality. That would be somebody smurfed the forced landing. They should have been able to make their forced landing, and they crashed trying to do a forced landing. And in that, you have to try to, there's different classifications of that where you have to make a judgment as to whether your abnormality means you need to kind of land at the next airport, or if it's bad enough that you need to be looking for the next field to put it down pretty quick, or the third case of doesn't matter what you do, you're going to be on the ground in 2 minutes. You can either be laying upside down, bleeding, dead in a ball of aluminum, or you can be walking away from the aircraft depending on how successful you are putting it down. Anyway, that's what that is. Mishandled abnormality means screwed up a forced landing. Terrain collision, but not spatial disorientation. Loss of AHRS, which is attitude heading reference system. Something gets screwed up with your gauges, leads to a crash. And then non-stabilized approach. And then in the uncontrolled flight into terrain is LTOT. That's loss of thrust on takeoff. You take off, your engine quits, and you stall and spin into something and crash and die from it. The next big one, and these are the two big ones. Loss of speed awareness. That's usually on approach to landing. You get too slow. You get into something where you have to do too tight of a turn while you're going too slow, and your plane stalls, and you crash. And there's a concept called DMMS, which I'll talk about. Have you ever heard that term, Jan? DMMS? You haven't heard that one. Okay, I didn't think so. Okay, uncontrolled FIT also. VMC rollover, that's in twins. Mid-air collisions, which do still rarely happen. And in-flight icing. And then screwed up or messed up go-arounds. I use smurfed and smeg. There's a story behind that. But failed flight control systems, rejected takeoff. That's where you think you're going to take off, you decide not to take off, you pull the power, and a lot of times people veer off the runway and smash into something. And anyway, that's what those are. And then oddly, the pilot's seat slides back or dislodges. That's actually a cause of accidents. You don't hear about it a lot, but it does happen. You take off, your seat slides back, and you're pulling the yoke back trying to get up with it, and you'll see videos of people taking off, and it'll go kerplunk. That's where the lash on their seat didn't engage right. Anyway, that's one of the buckets. Okay, so you go through all of those, and each one of those classifications, what you should do and what it is and everything, each one of those is an hour-long MPA program on each one of those. So I'm not going to get into the details of those. But generally, in an AQP program, what are they going to try to teach you? Pre-flight preparation and inspection, aeronautical decision-making, using checklists. And a lot of this is stuff the FAA is pushing on us in the traditional BFR. Pre-flight briefing, and I'm talking that's at the threshold. What AQP is wanting you to do is when you're at the threshold, you're getting ready to get on the center line to take off, you go through, if we get to this point on the runway and we're not at a certain speed, we're going to abort the takeoff. If we get off the ground and we lose an engine, we're going to go into that field over there. If we get to this point and something happens, we're going to do something else. And you do that briefing just before you take off of every step you're going to take if different things go wrong. Rejected takeoff, how you're going to do the rejected takeoff, or how you're going to trigger the rejected takeoff. Intentional IMC, you're going to talk about unintentional IMC. What do you do if you get into the soup by accident? Loss of thrust on takeoff. A lot of the scenarios they put you through on AQP BFR is loss of thrust on takeoff. You take off, you lose your power. Which field are you going to go to? Are you going to try to screw with it, try to get it going, or are you going to try to save your life? Inadvertent IMC that's a spatial disorientation thing. If you're flying at night, you fly into a cloud, and you can't see nothing. How do you get out of that? basic terrain avoidance, in-flight loss of vacuum, your instruments go dead, autopilot failure, DMMS on approach to landing, and I'll talk to that in a minute, abnormals in flight, things that cause you to do a forced landing, stabilize approach, and go-arounds. Okay, so what do you think the airlines are teaching their people? Let me go back. The airlines are teaching all of their people in their AQ programs that exact list. And that's what AQP is doing in the airlines. What do you think the airlines are not doing in their programs? The airlines are not doing power on stalls, power off stalls, cross control stalls, blah, 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 blah. They're not doing these crazy maneuvers in all of their recurrent training. I mean, they are, but that's not the focus of the recurrent training the way it has been in general aviation. So they go through, and that's what they're doing. Anyway, so that's basically what is happening. So go through a couple of examples. The DMMS is when you're coming into land and you get too slow on your approach, if you have to make a steep turn somehow, your stall speed goes way up and you can easily stall. And most GA accidents in this category are initiated way below 1,000 feet AGL. There is no chance of a spin recovery. The best way to handle that is to avoid it. And the way to avoid it is to keep your speed up. Okay, so they came up with, or I don't know if Dan Greider came up with this or something he found somewhere, the defined minimum maneuvering speed. And he calculates, he says in his videos, he calculates it as 1.404 times the stall speed at landing configuration, I think. And what they're getting people to do is placard their airspeed indicator with a piece of colored electrical tape or a grease pencil or something, that speed, and you know that you're not supposed to drop below that speed when you're in the pattern until you are absolutely on short final. And if you do that, you're not going to have one of these stall spins in your approach. Anyway, that's the purpose of the AQP for that particular bucket of things. Another example, mid-airs. This has come up here just lately. There was a mid-air collision in Colorado, I think, back 2 or 3 months ago. I think you heard about that. You're shaking your head, yes, yeah. And it's been all over the internet as to who communicated what and who's responsible for who said what and all this stuff. Well, they typically happen at uncontrolled fields, usually involving a miscommunication of some sort or somebody doing some sort of a non-standard pattern, which is okay, but as long as you communicate, or they do both. Somebody's doing a non-standard pattern and it doesn't get communicated between the two. They just announce their position and go on. And you have two people announce the same position and not really talk to each other, and they end up colliding or get close to it. So in the training for AQP training, the solution to that would be, use your ADSB if you have it, be, situational awareness of where everybody else is and what they're doing and what their attention level is, and radio communication, actually communicate, don't just announce. And here in the last 2 weeks, Dan Greider's really been on that. He's gotten into arguments over people who say, well, no, you just need to say you're on downwind, that's sufficient. Well, no, he says if you're getting ready to turn base to final and somebody's doing a straight in, you need to communicate, regardless of what the rules say, you need to say, I'll let you go first, I'll extend my downwind, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, that's the point of the AQP. That's what you don't get in traditional BFRs and so on. But, okay, now we get to, there's another thing coming, which is called and I wish Carl was here for this because he could speak about this, I would hope, the AQP BFR, except they don't call it the AQP VFR. They're trying to call it what I've seen it called, Aviation 101 did a publication, they call it the AQP AFR. It's AQP-oriented flight review. Now, the interesting thing, the FAA does not call it a biannual flight review anymore. They just call it a flight review. But they say you have to have it at a minimum every 24 calendar months. But you can do it more often. Well, some people are saying you need to do this annually, not every 2 years. Well, the FAA doesn't really define a flight review, except very loosely. A flight review is a review of those maneuvers and procedures that, at the discretion of the person giving the review, are necessary for the pilot to demonstrate the safe exercise of the privileges of the pilot's certificate. The translation of that, translated, the instructor has a lot of discretion for custom building the training program for the client unique to his aircraft and his type of flying. And the FAA even has a circular out that encourages the custom design of flight reviews. So, for the AQP flight reviews, they're saying what we need to be looking at doing is doing these scenarios instead of just going up and doing turns and doing a couple of short field landings and quizzing on runway markings and so on. We need to be doing these scenarios of what happens on the things that people get killed in and be prepared for them when they happen to you. So, and in the course of those scenarios, the basic maneuvers that you're supposed to have under your belt, you're going to be able to demonstrate to somebody that you're capable of doing them, whether you've done them or not. So they're thinking that the AQP flight review is going to be an extension beyond the traditional flight review, traditional training. Anyway, that's basically, it's an advanced extension of what you get in traditional instruction. Okay, so when I was trying to prepare for this talk, I didn't see how long this was. I was trying to keep it under an hour. Am I under my? Okay, this is the last slide, believe it or not. I put up there's a Facebook page that Dan Greider contributes to, and I thought he might see this. I said, hey, I'm having to speak to the group. I'm the emergency backup speaker. What do I say about it? They want me to do something on safety. What do I say about it? And some people had some suggestions. And this is something that Dan Greider wrote on my post. And I thought it's good to, and this kind of says what, I'm not going to teach AQP. I'm just here to tell you what it is so you're aware of it. If you want to look up more, that information's out there. And Dan's quote is, AQP is simply a philosophy borrowed from 121, which is the airlines. The big boys have more capabilities. They actually take initial type rating check rides, annual checks using AQP scenarios. In GA, we just recognize that we will never change the FAA, which means the FAA is never going to mandate this. They're going to stick with their traditional requirements. And we volunteer to learn about the AQP scenarios that can kill us. We prevent accidents by learning and practicing in advance. And that kind of, in a nutshell, tells you what AQP is. And I hope that improved your understanding of it to where you'd want to go learn more about AQP. So anyway, so press the stop button. Thank you for the encouragement. Okay, any questions? Well, thank you.
If we don't have time for questions, they're going to kick us out.
Oh, we're fine. Well, I'm wondering how long that really was.
That's probably 50.
Okay, do what?
About 50 minutes. We were thinking about.
Yeah, I'm really wanting to get this down around under 40.
Why don't you go turn
But I still didn't know what it was.
I will here in just a minute. I'm going to shut these off one at a time. I think they're all still running.
How much more time would you have done?
How much more time could I have done?
Yeah.
If I started talking about each one of those, I could go on 3 or 4 hours.
You
Seriously.
want to come back? You want to come back in next?
Oh,
another
no,
couple
no, no, no,
months?
no, 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 no.
Okay.
Well, I don't know. I think I'm going to be the emergency backup speaker.
Okay.
So